Yes, it is that time of year once again where we have to pick our Formula One fantasy teams just ahead of the first Grand Prix of the season, the Australian Grand Prix this time around. There are a couple of rule changes this season that need to be taken into account. First and foremost, and the most impactful rule change in my opinion, is that every team will now get points for pit stops during the Grand Prix based on their fastest pit stop. So the drivers themselves, doesn't matter which of the two drivers does get that fastest pit stop, but they will get bonus points for it. And an extra 5 points will go to the constructor who records the fastest pit stop of the race. And if they even set a new world record, which I'm not expecting to see at all this season, if we see it once, that'll be absolutely incredible. They will also score an extra 15 bonus points. And to be honest, going into this Formula One fantasy season, I think this is the most unpredictable year that we've had in a very long time. I have no idea who is going to come out on top during the Australian Grand Prix, especially when it comes to the midfield teams. It feels like everybody is all in the mix. But I do think that picking the constructors will be the most important aspect of your Formula One fantasy team. The Constructors' Championship last year at the top all the way down through to the bottom was pretty close, apart from Stake Sauber. But even they look like they might be in the mix this season. You have to remember that the Constructors will score a combined total of their two drivers. So if you're umming and ahhing between two drivers that look quite strong, like Charles Leclerc versus Lewis Hamilton, maybe just opt for Ferrari as a constructor because they get their combined total points. And because a lot of the teams got their driver business done last year and don't really want to change before 2026, a lot of the teams have really strong driver pairings. You're looking at Williams having a driver pairing of Alex Albon and Carlos Sainz, two drivers that could easily slot into any of the top four teams. And I do think you want to be choosing two of those top four teams to really get the best out of the constructors. For me, it's a bit of a coin flip. You've got McLaren versus Ferrari and then Red Bull versus Mercedes as the two sides of the coin. And for me, just because I want a little bit more budget, I would go Ferrari and Mercedes as the two. I think Ferrari have the slightly stronger driver pairing. And as I say, you get the combination of points. So slightly veering on the side of Lewis Hamilton, not being too far off the pace compared to McLaren, who already have Lando and Oscar, who have been there a little while. And then on the side of Mercedes, it's really tricky. Max Verstappen is clearly the best driver out of the four between Red Bull and Mercedes. I don't think George Russell will do too badly, although he hasn't had the best of luck in Australia over the last few years. And then you're looking at Lawson versus Kimi Antonelli. Again, I do think Lawson is the better driver than Kimi Antonelli at this point because Lawson has those 10 Grand Prix worth of experience. But on the flip side, there's just something that calls me to the Mercedes team. I think that the Mercedes car is going to be a little bit quicker than the Red Bull this first time around. We've seen Red Bull make quite a lot of changes to their car in the last few sessions and over the course of testing, whereas Mercedes do look a little bit more comfortable, and it's supposed to be quite cold and quite rainy in Australia. And I know that you shouldn't build your team just for this first session, but Mercedes in those cooler conditions have shown that they can be very, very quick and possibly even get a win under their belts first round in Australia. Now, I appreciate that that doesn't leave you with too much budget when it comes to the drivers. For me, Lando Norris being the most expensive driver does make sense, but he's maybe a little bit overpriced. And similar with Max Verstappen, I don't have too much faith in that Red Bull car. I think you're better off going for drivers a little bit further down the line. And therefore, my first kind of main driver pick is going to be Oscar Piastri. I think looking at the price difference between Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris and the fact that Oscar Piastri could hit the ground running this season, for me, he is a brilliant pick. Was slightly lower than Lando Norris last year in terms of points per million. Norris got 1.12 point per million versus 1.08. But I think Oscar Piastri going into this weekend, of course, his home race, could get driver of the day straight off the bat. And he had the third best differential last year in terms of price. So I'm imagining that that 23.0 million is going to get better. Whereas Lando Norris already being 30 million, it's going to be quite hard for him to gain any value on that. Aston Martin and Fernando Alonso were then calling to me, obviously the fifth fastest team last year, and Fernando Alonso easily the best driver in the midfield. But I'm scared of them this season. They're normally the team that starts strongest. You look at 2023, they were on the podium. 2024, they were on par with Mercedes, and then it fell away during the season. But if there's any team that's looking at 2026, it's got to be the Aston Martin lineup, which is where I think the Williams drivers have gained their value from. The Williams drivers, a little bit expensive for me. 13.1 million for Carlos Sainz. 60% of people have chosen him though. And if I was going to pick a Williams driver, I do think I would back Carlos Sainz. Alex Albon, 14% pick, but still 12 million. I think there are some more budget options that I would prefer to get. I'm scrolling all the way down and I'm looking at the Haas duo of Esteban Ocon and Ollie Behrman. And that just looks great to me. Ollie Behrman only had 2 races in a Haas last year. I appreciate that. But he did average 10.5 fantasy points in those 2 races. And I know he's just had a crash in free practice 1, but I really do back Ollie Behrman to have a really good season. I think of the rookies, he is the one that I am most excited about. And yes, the Haas car maybe doesn't look as quick as we thought it was going to, but I back Ollie Behrman to get the best out of it, even if he did miss free practice 1 and free practice 2. Usually at this point, I'd then add a Pierre Gasly into the mix, but he's quite expensive as well this year. Pierre Gasly, 11.8 million. I back Pierre Gasly, and throughout 2023 and 2024, he had a really good return on points. But I think he's maybe just that little bit too expensive considering I'm going for a constructor heavy build this year. So I'm going down towards the bottom of the pack. And actually, I looked at Zhou Guanyu's performances last year, which seems insane to say considering Stake Sauber were by far and away the worst team and Zhou the slower of the 2 Stake Sauber drivers. But he actually had a really solid points per million score across last season, despite the Stake Sauber car being awful, because he kept himself out of trouble. And I think even if he qualified down the order, he would then make up for it by gaining positions in the race. And Bortoleto, for me, is definitely an upgrade on Zhou Guanyu. It's then whether you want Nico Hülkenberg or Gabriel Bortoleto. I know that Hülkenberg has the experience, and I really do back Hülkenberg to do quite well again this season. He was by far and away one of the best midfield drivers last year. But there's a part of me that wants to go for Gabriel Bortoleto. I'm kind of torn between the two. Do I go for a double Stake Sauber driver pairing, though? I'm not so sure. I'm going to back Gabriel Bortoleto for now, just because I've only got 14.5 million left. But if you went for Nico Hülkenberg, I can completely understand why you would do that. And then I've got myself into a little bit of a predicament. I'm going to be honest with you, I wasn't expecting to only have 14.5 million left at this point. Esteban Ocon is also calling to me. Is that too much Haas? I do want to go quite broad. The problem with this season is I do think the grid is going to split into 2. You're going to have the top 4 teams and then the bottom 6. But in and amongst that, anything could happen. Like you could easily have Red Bull, Mercedes, McLaren or Ferrari win a race. And you could easily have both of the Williamses, both of the Aston Martins, both of the Haas's, both of the Alpines inside of the top 10 at some point. So it is quite tricky from this point forwards. I'd love to put in Pierre Gasly. Do I back Jack Doohan that much? Maybe I do back Jack Doohan to perform. Obviously, his home race as well, first time around in Australia. Will he gain a little bit of money because the Alpine car's quite good? And then you could sell on Jack Doohan later on in the season. I don't mind that as a pick. But then we're looking at Hülkenberg, Hadjar, Ocon. It's a tricky one. Do you just back Esteban Ocon to double up the Haas points? Haas aren't looking amazing, but I can understand why you would maybe do it. Hülkenberg, I do really like. And then Hadjar is a little bit of an outside shout, but the RB card did look really good in free practice too. I think you could go for any of those 3. What's the higher choose rate? Esteban Ocon, 31%. Hülkenberg, 34%. Hadjar, 33%. There's nothing in it, is there? I would go, just for this one, let's mix it up and let's go Isaac Hadjar, just so we've got a really broad team that is covering lots and lots of different point scoring possibilities. Now, can we improve this a little bit? Can we upgrade anybody to someone that I'd really want? I could get rid of a Doohan and maybe go for a Stroll, but do I want to do that? No, I think I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to lock this in as my first driver pick. Now, obviously, you get to pick 3 teams, so let's reset and we'll go once again. For this second pick, again, I want it to be quite competitive, so I'm going to go for the opposite side of the coin. I'm going to go McLaren, and then do I have the budget to put a Red Bull in? I was going to say, because it's a bit of a 50-50 between McLaren and Ferrari for me. I think you have to have one of the two. And then it's Red Bull versus Mercedes. But with the Red Bull being that little bit more expensive, and as I say, but it's the Kimi Antonelli factor. I'm just really not sure about that Mercedes package. Do I have enough money to put Red Bull Racing in there? We'll have to wait and see. I think this is going to be a little bit of a mix one. Because I've got Red Bull Racing, I then want to cover a little bit of Mercedes. George Russell versus Kimi Antonelli. I'm backing George Russell initially. That might swap to Kimi Antonelli in a second. I think you still want Gabriel Bortoleto in there. I think you still want Ollie Behrman in there. So then I've got 11.1 million. Is it then just a Hadjar and a 4.9 million? Okay, so you can't get Red Bull Racing and McLaren into the same team and it still look possibly workable. So then, if I go for double constructor Mercedes again, could get an Ocon, could get a Doohan, could get a Behrman, Hulkenberg. Again, it's that same decision, isn't it? It's Ocon versus Doohan versus Hulkenberg. Do you know what? Again, I think you want to go broad. I think you want to chuck a Jack Doohan in there. I think you want to spread out your teams as much as you possibly can. And then for my third and final pick, I'm going to have a little bit more fun with it. I'm going to go with the teams that, instead of going with just my head, I'm going to go a little bit with my heart in this one. I do think the McLaren are going to be the best car. I think the Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri will score the most points. Get the McLaren in there. Therefore, I'm going to slightly go off-piste, and I'm going to pick the Alpine team to be second of that, because I do really like Gasly. Haven't been able to put him into any of my teams so far. Maybe I could put Gasly in. Oh, do I put Gasly in the Williams constructor, because they've got a really solid driver pairing in Alex Albon and Carlos Sainz. Then Charles Leclerc as being my main driver. Pierre Gasly, can I afford? I can afford. Gasly versus Sainz is the battle I'm having in my head right now. Let's go Gasly for a moment. Let's see what we can do. I still want Behrman. I still want Bortoleto. They're kind of mind over matter as it is anyway. And then I'm stuck at the crossroads of Nico Hulkenberg versus Isaac Hadjar again. Do I go Hadjar? That's not a bad little driver lineup itself. I think going slightly lower, I really like having Charles Leclerc in there. Charles Leclerc, for me, was the best driver throughout last season outside of Max Verstappen. And I don't think that the Red Bull is quite going to be where the Ferrari is. Charles Leclerc, you're basically guaranteeing yourself qualifying points there. Pierre Gasly, I think, will have a really solid season in the midfield. Ollie Behrman, Bortoleto, Hadjar. Notice that a lot of my teams are very rookie heavy, but I think that's mainly because I'm going for those premium constructors, and that's where I think the points will be this year. So that's my third team. I'm going to lock that in, and we'll see what all three teams look like. So these are my three teams. I'm still fairly happy with them. I think, again, you just want a really broad spectrum of teams to start off this year because it is going to be so unpredictable. And unfortunately, Australia is a little bit of an outlier track because, one, we might get rain on Sunday, and two, it is unlike some of the other circuits that are coming up fairly quickly. And we've got a sprint race in China. So I'm trying to do two things here. Trying to cover all bases so I can get some substitutes in if needed for China, with it being a sprint weekend. And I'm also trying to make a little bit of money because I think going for the slightly lower drivers in terms of, you know, Oscar Piastri over Lando Norris or Behrman over Ocon just will allow those drivers to go up in price that little bit more. Again, allowing for maybe some substitutions at some point over the next couple of Grand Prix weekends once we know which teams really lie where in terms of the constructor standings this year. If you did enjoy this video, I also made this video here where I go through every single one of those constructors and talk about what they need to improve going into the 2025 season. And actually, some of them have already made some of the improvements that I talked about here. So click that link and I'll see you next time.